Welcome to HCD's Mindset. I'm Michelle Nigella.
And I'm Kathryn Ambrose.
We are on a mission to help you identify what consumer science innovations have a lot of untapped value or are too good to be true.
So join us for more curious conversations as we try to make sense of the complex but fascinating world of human behavior. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Mindset. We are very excited today to have two really awesome guests with us today. This is our first time ever having two guests, so I'm really excited to get started. We have a returning guest, Martha Bajec, with us, our lovely HCD's consultant now. But then in addition to Martha, we have the Dr. David Nathan with us. Both of you, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm so glad you guys could join us in this conversation. We have so much to talk about. We've had emails back and forth about all the possible things to talk about. So I think that this is going to be really fun. But I think a really great place to start is really a little bit about yourself. Dr. Nathan, I'm going to call you David, but do want to acknowledge that you do have a very impressive background. So I do want you to talk a bit about that. Martha, we have been introduced to you before, so I don't know if we really want to go into that again, but we are going to be talking about your role with David as well, and with ASTM. But I would love to hear what we like to call your origin story. So if you could tell us your origin story.
Starting with me.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm originally from Philadelphia, grew up inside the city and then right outside in the suburbs. I did my undergraduate studies at Princeton University, then decided to go to medical school, went to the University of Pennsylvania, finished there with a very strong interest in psychiatry. It was the one rotation when I was going home and just reading stuff on my own, even though it wasn't even assigned. Good sign that that's the kind of field you want to go into. So I did my residency at McLean Hospital, which is part of Harvard Medical School, finished there in 4 years, did my chief residency in bipolar and psychotic disorders, moved down here with my wife, and here is Princeton, New Jersey. We raised two kids. They're now 21 and 18. And my origin story in the drug policy arena really started in medical school when I was the graphics editor for an ethics journal. And our first issue was on the question of drug policy. And this is, mind you, 1990 or so. So very early on in the height of the drug war. And I had been raised like most kids of my generation as a drug warrior. Drugs were bad, the people who used them were bad, and the people who sold them were unworthy of their freedom. And so I accepted that because all of those things made sense to me. And when I saw the two main articles for that journal, one was done by William Bennett, who was the drug czar under President Reagan. The other article was by, who was then a Princeton professor, later the founder of the Drug Policy Alliance, Ethan Nadelman. Hadn't heard of Ethan then, though he's been a mentor to me in more recent years. Reading both articles, I saw what I expected to see about the drug war from William Bennett. And then I read Ethan's article, and I say it was one of the few moments of true epiphany in my life, where if half of what he was saying was true, then I had it all wrong all these years. And that the drug war was just a bad idea. And it started there. It kind of percolated for many years through my medical school, my residency, my early years of practice, and started just accumulating all these experiences with patients whose lives were destroyed by drugs, not so much by the use of the drugs themselves, but by the drug war. And in no case was it more obvious that the cure was worse than the disease was in the case of cannabis, where very few of my patients had problems that were directly or primarily related to cannabis, but many of them their lives had been greatly affected adversely by arrests for cannabis possession, very low-level offenses for a drug that I understood by that time was much more benign than alcohol. And finally, after hearing one of these stories around 2009, I decided I'm going to write an op-ed, which is something I would do. I write op-eds on a variety of topics, take up causes that I believe in. And this one, thinking I was adding my voice to the many physicians who have spoken out on it, realized I was so far out in front on this issue. It immediately started leading to a lot more articles and requests for presentations. And years later, I was asked to participate in New Jersey's legalization push. Realized that my physician friends who agreed with me on cannabis policy really were very uncomfortable putting their names out there. And so I started looking nationally at who are the main physicians who are respected figures who we can say are unimpeachable in their credentials, who also agree about the futility of the war on cannabis. And when I found enough of them, we decided to create this group called Doctors for Cannabis Regulation. We founded it in 2015. We launched it in 2016. And now 6 years later, almost to the day, we are a thriving organization with a president who is one of the leading addiction specialists in the country, and a board that includes a diversity of individuals who are expert on cannabis use and very knowledgeable on bringing change to our drug policy generally and cannabis specifically. And so that's how I got here in the broadest of brushes.
No, that's a really great origin story. I really like that. And what I think is interesting, and I'd like to get your thoughts on, are so, we study consumer perceptions and the way consumers interact with products and what really drives their behavior. And in a lot of the research that we've been doing around cannabis and cannabis products, and, what are the consumers' perception around these ideas of being acceptable as general consumer products, is that there is still so much stigma. There seems to be, in a lot of ways, the anti-cannabis, the anti-drug movement, the war on drugs, it was very effective at training generations of people to, no matter what they may be educated with, they're always going to have a bit of a perception of unhealthiness. So I just like to hear kind of your thoughts around that. What perceptions are. Is this something that you've seen changing, or do you think that it's so deep rooted in some of us that grew up with DARE? What do you see in that?
So I do think perceptions are changing, but even in myself, I'm still, as in my job as a psychiatrist, I have to be a student of human behavior, including my own. And actually, my major in college was animal behavior. So I say that, I'm still doing the same thing as back then, except now I'm working with a particular primate species instead of spiders, which was kind of the focus of my work in college.
It's a more complicated animal, basically.
Yes. Yeah, you really get to understand spider behavior and can predict what they're thinking, not so much with people.
Right.
But we are off, in many ways, we're more similar than we are different. And when what you're learning from a young age is a particular point of view that you're told is common sense, you come to accept it as such. And so even now I see in myself the slight sense of shame I can experience for supporting this issue so many years later. I'd say I'm mostly over it, but at the same time, I still appreciate that we still think that there's something vaguely immoral about the very topic of drug use, even if we're talking about a relatively benign drug compared to the drugs that society considers to be perfectly acceptable, such as alcohol.
Right.
Absolutely. And it's humbling as well to have that acknowledgement and that acceptance that, maybe and this is true for science in general, that we may have not had it right 20, 30 years ago, but we're learning from our mistakes and evolving and creating new hypotheses. That's what we do in research. That's what we do in science and in medicine all the time. But I do think that especially it's incredible that you were able to take your acknowledgement of this and then, like you said, bring it to a more broad scale and take it a little bit more to a national level. So have you seen quite a good bit of change since you've been working on that national scale and working with policy?
Absolutely. I see the change in lawmakers who thought of this as something to be scoffed at, something that they considered to be just funny, that a doctor would take such a point of view, to now where we're not talking so much about whether to legalize and regulate cannabis, but rather how are we going to do it? And that's really the conversation we're having. Even those who are opposed to cannabis legalization have some understanding that, well, first of all, it's obviously happening because it's passed in many states. I believe we're still at 18 and counting, though it's changing every year. 18 out of our 50 states have cannabis fully legalized. And I see the change in individuals. Now, one thing that hasn't changed is the teen perception that cannabis can be harmless for them because it's often not harmful for adults. That's not something that's new, though the opposition will point to that as a consequence of legalization. And I really see it as quite the opposite. What I see is that teens believe that cannabis is harmless, which it is most certainly not in the developing brain, but they perceive it thus. Why? Because what they've been hearing about cannabis over all these years has, let's face it, just been untrue.
Right.
They've told that it's a gateway to harder drugs, and it is no more so a gateway than alcohol or tobacco. And all of the so-called soft drugs really are just the drugs that happen to get used first in people who are prone to misuse of any or all drugs. And so kids have known that what we're telling them was not true. And our laws would tell them that cannabis is harmful for everyone, and that's why it's against the law for everyone. And they knew that wasn't true. So really, legalization can change the hearts and minds of teenagers to understand that what is a socially and medically acceptable habit or activity for adults is neither socially nor medically acceptable for them in recreational use. By creating a distinction between adult use and underage use, we create not just a distinction in the medical effects of cannabis, but also a respect for the law that has been very much lacking in the discussion around cannabis. And that's why cannabis in my kids' high school is at least as popular as alcohol, because they regard it as less harmful than alcohol. And we certainly can't say that that's the case for teenagers.
Interesting. And I think maybe with the legalization question, this brings in Martha to the conversation. How do you think differences might be between the US and Canada? Is Canada kind of a way to look at what's in the future for the US as far as those sort of opinions, or do you see a change that's happened in youth? And that's for you, Martha.
Do you mean like a change that's happened in youth, like fewer youth are initiating use with legalization?
Right. So kind of like in line with what David was saying about, how they might view whether or not it's healthy, some of the misconceptions that have kind of come along with cannabis. Is the gateway sort of topic more of a US based thing? Are people letting go of it faster in Canada than, they are in the US? Just wondering if there's any ways to see what happened in Canada and if that can predict the changes that might happen in the US. Granted, US is a slightly different story and journey, but your thoughts.
Beast. Yeah, I mean, they are all beasts. I think that it's opened everyone up a lot more to looking at things as individual pieces, not as a blanket. Like, you know, Schedule 1 means it has no utility for anybody anywhere ever on the face of the planet, so don't even bother. Like, everything has some utility somewhere, and I think there's a lot more open-mindedness about what things we thought were bad before could be used for, you know, how can we use them for good, basically.
Mhm.
I think it would be a really interesting study to run on attitudes in adolescence, especially like now, because they've, you know, they were kind of coming to consciousness with legalization. So,
Yeah.
you know, kids like my kids age 13, that
Mhm.
this is within their lifespan, right? Like I have
Yeah.
friends that got popped for smoking joints. It's
Mm.
Yeah.
like this is all very fast. And I think they're the ones that are the first cohort out of the drug war thinking, right?
Mhm.
Like when I make the joke, like, oh, this is your brain on drugs. My kid has no idea what I'm talking about. Like I had to show him one of these commercials and he's like, but I love eggs. And I was like, that's not the point. The eggs are good. Don't vilify eggs. Come on.
The eggs were effective.
Yeah. But
Yeah, and he's growing up looking at cannabis as that's the medicine that mom takes.
Mhm.
Right.
And mom is more active and interactive now than when she was managing everything with bennies and opioids and barbiturates, because, you know, she's conscious for more of the day
Wow.
and lucid for more. I mean, opioids, they're taxing,
They're
man.
intense.
They're
Yeah.
a lot.
And I
Yeah.
would want to touch a little bit on something that that David had brought up, this idea of we're reaching a point of not if we will legalize, but how we should approach legalization and what are the steps we should take. I know that HCD was actually involved in helping with some of this research. Martha, would you mind touching on it? And then David, if you want to color in, please feel free.
Yes, absolutely. And it was research proposed by David and a few other members of ASTM, where we need information to know how to properly signify the presence of cannabinoids to consumers.
So I do
And
think we have to probably take a little bit of a step back there in case listeners don't know what
oh, right.
ASTM is. So why ASTM? What is it?
So ASTM, if I remember right, is the Association for Standards and Testing Materials, or American. I don't know. The acronym's hard to find now. It's just ASTM International everywhere you look. But it is an organization that for decades has been setting through industry volunteer collaboration. I think it's pretty much all volunteer on the participant side, on the member side, with a few officers basically setting standards and specifications to be used by different industries in process, manufacture, and distribution of any kind of good that you can imagine, from the suction power specification standard for a vacuum cleaner to how to substantiate with statistics advertising claim for marketing use, and the treads on boots and the thickness of a screen for this type of utility, like just anything you can imagine. There's a standard for, and ASTM is one of
And there's
two
good reason for that,
major
right?
organizations.
Because,
Yeah.
you know, I've been watching this show on the History Channel called The Food That Built America, and it's a really interesting show. But it's interesting that, you know, back you know, late 1800s, early 1900s, when there were no standards, right? People could really make anything and call it whatever they want and put it out there. And consumers really weren't well protected about what they were being sold, which is a very dangerous situation. So making sure that, you know, treads on boots have to be a certain way, or that the specifications about your tractor or your lawnmower, like these things need to be really standardized so that we all understand that if we buy this product or that product, it's all going to, it is what it says it is, right? So that's kind of like the purpose.
Right.
So there is a committee for cannabis. And Dr. Nathan, how did you join? How did you become part? Because, you were talking about how you, found these other physicians and experts in the medical field that had come to the same realization as you. What brought you into ASTM?
So what brought me in was a confluence of my interests. One thing that was not so much my interest, or at least my wheelhouse, is the running of a large nonprofit. And that's what DFCR had started turning into. I'm good at building things. I'm an idea person. But once DFCR got big and was ready for that next level, we needed people who were pros, who know how to run things. So I wanted to step back and focus on specific aspects of legalization and regulation. And I've always been interested in graphic design. In fact, it was that journal in medical school that got me into, that introduced me to the whole question of drug policy reform as a graphic designer. And I couldn't think of anything more fun than the idea of making designs, not just of a universal cannabis symbol that would be put on products and that would make those products easily identifiable as cannabis products, but also other aspects of labeling in a way that really speaks to how people read things literally and figuratively. So a cannabis information label, talking to friends who say that the cannabis they get from either a regulated or unregulated source is very poorly labeled. It's hard to figure out what exactly you're getting. And also cannabis package warnings, because in a number of states, there are requirements for package warnings, and they are so complex and onerous that it winds up being just a little box of very tiny print that they've pretty much made sure nobody is ever going to read. And so part of my
so that must be slightly pushed by industry, I would imagine, because they would be worried that a label would prevent someone from purchasing.
You might think so, except that a lot of what's in there is jargon that clearly was written by staffers of lawmakers thinking we need to cover this and we need to cover that, and we need to make sure that we specify what the name of the law is and the number of the law that made this legal. This is not what should go into a package warning. What should go in is just the basics of who are the at-risk groups for cannabis use, which is a small minority of adults in adult use. But what can we do that actually is of use to society? And as a physician, of course, I have that interest in public health. How do we promote public health with proper labeling? And that doesn't mean needing to scare people, which is what a lot of lawmakers and
coming maybe from the whole cigarettes, right? And moving labels for that, where making it bigger and putting lungs on the package, etc.
Right, and those labels are of limited utility for a couple of reasons. One of them is the much higher rate of addiction from tobacco use, that people are much less likely to have a healthy relationship with tobacco. And also the fact that if you put hyperbolic statements, and not to say that tobacco, that cigarette use is good for you, because we all know it is really bad for you. It's one of the most unhealthy behaviors you can engage in. But if you have a certain kind of label, people may start tuning that out. What I see as a goal is to have a very short set of warnings that states what groups are at high risk from cannabis use and which groups need to talk to their doctors before they use cannabis. And if we can just convey that information, and people looking at their package, eventually, if they're looking at their package of weed long enough, they will commit that to memory, and they'll remember that we don't have enough safety data yet on pregnancy and breastfeeding, that people with certain psychiatric disorders are at higher risk from cannabis use. and that non-medical use of cannabis by minors should be discouraged. And if we can just convey some of those basic principles, we will have done most of the work we need to do in educating our society about the appropriate and the inappropriate use of cannabis.
And I think that is really interesting, linking back again to the discussion about Canada, and something that kind of struck me in what you were just saying is that different states have sort of different approaches they've taken to this. And, that presents a problem. So when we look at labeling, I think one thing within the guidance, and we'll have you guys do the origin story of the current, what's being set forth as the intoxicating symbol. But Canada has a symbol that they're using. And, it is national, right, Martha, which, makes it a lot more simple. And that's part of the reason I think we call the US being a beast in this sort of situation, because we do have different laws for different states. But that's, again, the purpose of ASTM is really to put forth a standard that everybody across the board can use. And I think, to your point, David, really talking about the necessary information, kind of similar to what you see with other products, so when you look at food, it needs to say whether or not it's in a facility with peanuts or soy or wheat or something like that, something that is pretty easy and set. So if you are that person, that you can very easily and simply look at the package and say, oh, I shouldn't have this. It's been made with wheat. Or may have touched wheat, so I'm going to put it away. So being able to do that is very important. So having that standard is very important. So I just wanted to make note of that. But let's hear a little bit about the origin story then of approaching this question, and maybe also mention it. So it's D37, correct? For the cannabis group within ASTM. And they are the ones that are sort of, investigating these questions about standardization for products that are just now sort of coming online as being, consumer products. So talk a little bit about, the origin story of like how the question came up to deal with this coming up with a label.
Excuse me. I think from my end, being a consumer, a patient, and seeing the breadth of the categories that have cannabis in them, the packaged goods that you can get cannabis in, candy, chocolate, like everything, anywhere you can imagine, you can put cannabis in, and it can be intoxicating or not. Where with like hard drugs like opioids, they're pills, they come in a bottle or a patch, like it's pharmaceutical feeling, looking, but cannabis can be anywhere. And you don't know it because nano emulsions and this and that and whatever, has no flavor, has no smell. And if your kid picks up that chocolate bar, well, they're not going to die, probably. Dr. Nathan, I think we can, correct, right? Like they're not, probably you're not going to.
Science supports what you just said. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's really scary and it's really horrible. And you don't want your kid to go through that, because why would you, right? So the idea of having this, and in Canada, we have the stop sign. It's very clearly a stop and think, stop and don't purchase, whatever. But the drive in the US isn't quite the same. And given the varying rate and degree of legalization or decriminalization, there needed to be something put forward in order for industry to adopt it, and hopefully, thus amplified through the entire system, and eventually, hopefully globally, because obviously these products are someday hoping to be outside of the US borders or Canada or wherever, so that we have a symbol that we can teach anybody, everybody, whoever, that this means that you're going to get high, probably.
What were some of the considerations that went into the development of the label? What were certain features that were really important to make sure that they either you hit on these targets or you didn't hit on these targets? I'm sure color, like you mentioned, the stop sign was is used in Canada. What were a few of those features that you considered?
So if I may,
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, my work on the symbol really kind of worked backwards in level of complexity, because I started out, well, I've always thought that our prescription labels in America are just atrocious in terms of how they present information. And what we need is to present complex information simply and make things easier to read. So I started by thinking about a cannabis information label. As that progressed, I came to realize that we need to start really simple and start with that very simple question of, is there intoxicating cannabis in this product? Period. End of story. And what is the message we want to convey? Well, of course, we want to convey caution. We're not conveying that message of prohibition that clearly didn't work to stop people from using cannabis. And so the stop sign, the color red, really just isn't appropriate for that. And so, and believe it or not, you would think, well, then it's obvious. You put a black cannabis leaf in a yellow triangle and call it a day and say that that's the warning triangle or the warning symbol. That's where we got to, of course. But through many incarnations, I did start with the triangle, but I started with different colors, including green. I tried multicolors, which along the way realized that that's not very kind to printers who may not have access to full color printing and may not be realistic. And it was finally by just thinking the simplest message is caution with cannabis, and a caution symbol that's internationally accepted, and the one symbol, the one graphical device that tells everybody that something is cannabis is the cannabis leaf. It's not a bong. It's not the letters THC, which are problematic for a number of reasons. It's just the leaf. And so that's what it eventually came down to. And after having gotten pretty close to that final version, that's when I reached out to ASTM, courtesy of a friend of mine, Michael Bronstein, who is very much involved in cannabis regulation through his organization, Attach. And he said, I think it's time you talk to the only consensus standard organization working on this right now, which is ASTM International. I had, of course, heard the name, but didn't know that much about consensus standards, and quickly learned once I reached out and realized that I too can be a participant in that process. I figured I was going to have to present this to some powers on high in ASTM, then realizing that no, this is in a sense the people's organization.
It is very grassroots.
Because it is really consensus.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Martha actually brought us in because, you know, we have this view, this way of studying consumer reactions, and she thought it would be important to have sort of the consumer perspective as part of this. And as I entered the group and in the discussions about the symbols and the work that was being done, what I thought was also very important, very interesting, is really thinking about how accessible all the pieces are. So having specifications, because again, ASTM is all about specifications about the exact color, the exact angles of everything, the exact design, so that it is replicable by anyone to be able to obtain and create and print, to your point, because it has to be accessible, it has to be easy to do. Real estate is such a, real estate on packaging is such a valuable piece of property when it comes to consumer products. And so having something that is set like that is so very important. And it was interesting to see sort of all those conversations.
Yeah,
So,
I would add here really quickly that I don't think you really appreciate how much goes into a small label or a small package until you really sit in on an hour and a half debate about if there should be a border or not and things like that, where it's so simple, but it's actually really, really important. And I would just like to highlight what David brought up earlier, is that simplicity is key. You want things to be as intuitive as possible, so that way the message gets across quickly. But Michelle, I know
it's something we say all the time, right? With consumer work that we do, it has to be intuitive. And, you know, to your point about the leaf is not just, you know, a leaf, like it is really an icon, and icon meaning that it is easily interpreted and recognizable. There's no question about what it is. Go ahead.
And for all the work we've been doing together, a question that I've been asked and I think is highly relevant to today's discussion is how we came up with the name, the International Intoxicating Cannabinoid Product Symbol. My original name for this was the Universal Cannabis Product Symbol, UPCS. UCPS, sorry. And I was thinking, well, that's a perfectly good name, realizing only by working with my colleagues that it's not exactly the message we want to convey. So I don't know who came up with IICPS, but as soon as I saw it, once I got over the bit of ego disappointment of, hey, they're not using my name for the symbol.
Everything else.
That actually is a lot better. So Martha, I think either you or somebody very close to you came up with that.
I think Darwin started it because he changed it to international, and then it fit awkwardly in the title. So it's not actually part of the title, it's later the name of the symbol itself, because the title of the work document it's a specification, right? It's not the symbol, it's the specification for what we're telling you now is the symbol. So, you can go and something I thought about the other day in terms of like black market, gray market, counterfeit, blah, blah, blah. Like Health Canada, to the best of my knowledge, the government of Canada is very particular that legal products only have the symbol, right? This is part of the legalization package. Yes, that this is a legal product. But the intoxicating symbol doesn't have that baggage, right? You almost want, even if you're black market, gray market, whatever you call it, wherever you are, even if you are working within that space, take it anyway and put it on your products that have intoxicating cannabinoids, because ultimately it's not about the industry, it's not about whoever, it's about consumers and them having a warning of the contents. So if you are,
speaking of which, warning of contents, we've said the word intoxicating several times. What does intoxicating actually mean? We let the doctor.
Yeah.
That one.
Definition, go.
Yeah, the medical definition is to affect the sensorium, the way of thinking, and alter somebody's state of consciousness. So to say that THC is psychoactive is not really that descriptive, because CBD is psychoactive. It's non-intoxicating, but it does have an effect on one's psychiatric state, if you will. And so saying something psychoactive, I mean, Tylenol is a bit sedating, therefore psychoactive, but clearly not intoxicating. But the term intoxicating, though it has the word toxic in it, and that does indeed mean poison, it's the word we're stuck with because there's no better descriptor in the English language. We would have to conceive of some neologism. People say, well, instead of intoxicating, we should use some other term, but there's nothing that is as applicable. You could say impairing, but what exactly does impairing mean and in what sense? And definitely it was a better term to use than saying a THC symbol, which is what a lot of states, in fact, the most common device other than the cannabis leaf is the letters THC, which will be for sure an antiquated concept within the next year or two, because there are other cannabinoids that are intoxicating. And what I like to say is there's hexyhydrocannabinol, which is not THC, that is perfectly legal, including in Pennsylvania, where I found something that contained it. trust me when I tell you that that is an intoxicating substance and definitely impairing. And so we can't just say THC is what's in this. We have to say it's an intoxicating.
Because I know that THC was one of those things that was talked about, right, instead of the leaf. And so I think another component, the leaf is recognizable and easily understood, but it also has to be timeless, because when you're making a specification, it's not so that you're going to change it in a couple of years, because obviously changing the symbol in a couple of years does not help the recognition factor.
Right. You want to set the norm, and in a way, trying to make something that's timeless and universal, you want it to kind of be rid of all preconceived notions of it, where THC may have that stigma to it. And so, like you said before, a leaf is going to be a leaf is going to be a leaf, regardless of the different compounds that it may be associated with. And that can change over time as well, which is really exciting and really impactful.
And it's kind of all encompassing as well. So it's not just focusing on one component of the cannabis product or the cannabis plant. It's really any, right? That would be
regardless of language as well, which is another huge component.
And that's really important, because I think that the use of THC is not just a bit of a misnomer when you're trying to equate it with intoxication from cannabis. It's not just, of limited utility based on education. It's really discriminatory for people who may not have the same level of competency or literacy or language recognition, who are kind of left out of a symbol like that. And I think it's for that reason that there are already international standards in place saying that safety signs cannot have alphanumeric characters or punctuation marks in them, with the single exception of the exclamation point in a very basic warning sign. Other than that, should never have any kind of language inside. Now, the IICPS, the cannabis symbol that we're talking about, was designed to have some message put below it, to the side of it, to convey more information. But a symbol should be just a symbol. It shouldn't be some kind of text message. And I think that's really what we were able to boil it down to over many months of work by many people.
And I think this is something that we can always link to and talk about in the future. But we did run a study looking at the perceptions of this intoxicating symbol, as well as some other symbols that are being looked at for non-intoxicating. And it is very successful. People interpret it exactly as it was meant to be. And that is certainly a credit to you, David. But I also just want to mention that it's also a credit to your son, right? So, which is super cool, since this was, graphic design was an interest of yours. Can you tell us just, a little bit as we get to the end here about how that played out?
Yeah, that's interesting, because when my son was little, he would watch me on Adobe Photoshop, fixing up old photographs from the family, or designing things for myself, or graphic designs for cards and gifts and art. And he would just sit and watch me while I did it. It's kind of, it's relaxing to see somebody doing something visual like that. And it wasn't long after that that he started doing things for himself on Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator. He got into cinematography and photography, and his website is elinathan.com. He himself started becoming my teacher by the time he was in middle school, because he grew up with it. He's an incredible talent and prodigy. And I say that, of course, completely objectively as his father. But no, I mean, he did all of the signage for the Parkland March. The March for Our Lives, not the logo that we're familiar with that was done in some other context, but rather the when you watched the march on TV from Parkland, Florida, all the t-shirts everybody was wearing, they were designed by our then 16 or 17-year-old son. And so he established himself in his own right. And he really did contribute enough ideas and technical support to earn him a co-design of this. And so we really are co-designers.
That's awesome.
That is awesome.
Then, of course, there's all the people at ASTM, you mentioned Darwin Millard, and you, Martha, everybody has their bit of, has their fingerprints on this symbol. And so, it did really take a village to get this done.
That is awesome. I'm nowhere towards the end and we could talk to you forever, but I want to make sure that we still have time to play our rapid fire free association game. I'm just going to say a couple words to you quickly, David, and then you just say the first thing that comes back. We're not going to put Martha in the hot seat today just because she's done it already. But David, are you ready?
I will relax my brain as much as my brain allows. So with that caveat, yes.
All righty. So first word, advocacy.
Activism.
Cannabis.
Marijuana.
Medicine.
Pharmaceuticals.
IICPS.
Many states adoption.
Regulation.
Effective.
Safety signs.
Good symbolism.
Edibles.
Dicey. And I'd like to explain that one. That edibles, people who are just starting out with cannabis should not be starting with edibles because it's too easy to overdo it. Too many people have learned that lesson the hard way. So
that's important to note. Hopefully this helps someone.
Consumer safety.
Utmost importance.
The color green.
Safety.
All right. And the last one, Eli Nathan.
Great guy.
Awesome. All right. Thank you all so much, both of you, for joining us today. This was an incredible conversation. Really quickly before we head off, if anybody has questions for you, David, where could they find you?
They can easily find me on the web. Best way to email me on these topics is dnathan, as in David Nathan, dnathan@dfcr.org. And the website for the work that I do is best represented in the Doctors for Cannabis Regulation website, and that is dfcr.org. And I answer all emails.
Great. Thank you. And Martha, do you have any place that you would want to recommend people find you?
Martha.Bajec@hcdi.net and LinkedIn and Twitter and wherever. I'm there. Say hi.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. And thank you everybody for tuning in. And we look forward to maybe having further conversations with everyone and for having everybody else join us in the future. So thanks, and everybody have a great day.
You too. And thank you so much.
For more information or updates, follow HCD Research on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter @HCD Research Inc. and @HCD Neuroscience. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and be sure to rate, review, and follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you, and stay tuned for more curious conversations.